Welcome to Coming Home. Survive and thrive in homeschooling. Today it is my pleasure to interview Dr. Stephen Meyer. He is director at the Discovery Institute, Center for Science and Culture in Seattle, USA. We will cover the importance of science in everyday life, what to teach the science-focused student, and what is necessary for a child uninclined towards the sciences. He will talk about teaching science in an interesting way if you're not confident in chemistry, physics, or biology, and will be recommending some resources. Dr. Meyer defines and discusses intelligent design and its relationship to evolution and creation. And for parents and students of faith, how to prepare for university, which is likely to undermine one's faith. All this and so much more we're going to talk about today. But overall, he brings you a direction and encouragement in the wonder of science. Hello to Dr. Stephen Meyer. Welcome. I'm so excited to have you here today.
I'm delighted to be with you, Christine, and to reconnect. Our families got to know each other back in 2015, and we've had some rendezvous since then, but it's nice to see you, albeit by Zoom. The new way of talking, right?
Oh, yeah, but I'm extremely grateful that you've agreed to an interview. Could you please start, Steve, by just telling our listeners who you are and what you do?
Sure. I direct a program at Discovery Institute here in Seattle in the United States called the Center for Science and Culture. And we're the institutional hub of a network of scientists who are interested in the evidence for design in nature. Our concept is called intelligent design. You've probably heard about it in the news, but we're interested in broader questions of how science and intersects with the big philosophical or worldview questions. So we have people working on topics in cosmology, in neuroscience, artificial intelligence. We're interested in the whole question of the nature of the human mind and how that is or is not different than, say, artificial intelligence. So those sorts of questions occupy a lot of our research effort. I myself write on the origin of two big questions: the origin of life and the origin of the universe, and what that has to say about whether or not there is a designing intelligence behind everything. And in my latest book, I actually addressed the question of the identity of the designing intelligence, looking at competing metaphysical or worldview hypotheses about how to explain nature, and arguing that classical theism, the idea of God, actually provides the best overall explanation for the big discoveries we've made about the origin of the universe and its fine-tuning, and the origin of life, for example. So I'm interested in those sorts of big questions.
Thank you. So thinking of a homeschool environment where in New Zealand, all you have to do is demonstrate your ability to be able to homeschool within the broad description of what the education department says has to happen. So you're free to design your own curriculum. Can you please explain to the mums and the dads setting up these curriculums, what is the importance of science?
Well, in the broadest sense, science just means, in the classical sense, scientia, meant knowledge. And it's come, though, in the last 2 centuries to refer to the knowledge we have of the natural world, of the processes that are at work in the natural world, of how the natural world in different parts originated. And so we have the different disciplines of science: physics, chemistry, biology, astronomy, focusing on different parts of the way the natural world works. And so much of our modern day technology is based first on understanding basic processes of basic natural processes in fields that are described in fields like chemistry and physics, or So engineering is based largely on things we've discovered in the field of physics, or chemical engineering is based largely on the field, things we've discovered in chemistry. And so science is important to technological advance. It's foundational to it. And so people that want to work in technology, that want to work in businesses that are developing technologies, are well served to have a very basic, at least, and maybe more scientific education. And then there are many fascinating jobs in pure science, doing the research that provides the basic understanding that we need to make technological innovations that make life better. So I think having an understanding of the world around us has been critical to the advance of Western culture. The big scientific revolution that started in roughly 1500, plus or minus a couple hundred years, was largely inspired by people of faith who believed that by studying the natural world, we could better make human life better. That we could, if we learned how God had designed the world, we could use that knowledge to improve the human condition. That was one of the arguments that Francis Bacon made in his defense of and elaboration of the case for science in his famous books. So that's just one reason. I'm fascinated with science because I think it also does end up addressing, there are branches of science that end up addressing the big philosophical or worldview questions. So I did a PhD in a field called the philosophy of science, but my dissertation was on the topic of origin of life biology, and this whole subject of how did the first life arise. It's a scientific topic that involves chemistry, biology, physics, the information sciences. It was absolutely fascinating, but the different theories about the origin of life inevitably have larger philosophical implications. So I've been long interested in scientific topics about origins or about the nature of human consciousness that are both scientific and philosophical, that have worldview implications. So I would say science is important for technology. It's important for philosophy. It's important for our view of human nature. It's important for medicine. I just went myself to see a doctor today, and he had a chart on the wall about the way the whole neurological system is wired into the brain. It's amazing, so, and you can't really treat illness without understanding how the design of the body is supposed to work. So all the science is crucial to so many parts of our human experience and endeavors these days.
Everyday life.
Right, and it's great for kids. It also teaches a disciplined way of thinking, which carries over. So I did a physics major. I'm not a physicist now, but there are many, many topics. I just wrote an article today about the debate about what the new James Webb Space Telescope is finding, and what that has to say about the Big Bang Theory. And I was talking to a colleague who is a PhD physicist, and I said, I was an okay physics student. I got the bachelor's degree. I said, and I never was going to be a great physicist, but having that background is it's a way of thinking that really helps you understand the world around you and helps you make sense of news stories and scientific debates that may enter into public policy. Science is very important for public policy. We've just experienced this whole this debate about the public health response to COVID, and being able to evaluate scientific evidence and information is critical for policymakers and for voters who are trying to decide which policy prescription about climate change or COVID health policy or many, many other things. So it's knowing stuff knowing stuff about the natural world turns out to be useful for living in it in lots of different ways.
I'm thinking of the homeschool mums, because this was my experience that very early on, I wasn't a very good science student. I was great at biology and just loved it, but for the others, so not so much. So I lacked the confidence to be able to take anything really past, well, here's a textbook, go learn your science. But it seems to me that homeschoolers have the ideal environment and the privilege to tailor-make an approach to science that is exciting,
very
Right.
hands-on, because you don't have the big teacher ratios to children. So especially for mums who might be lacking the confidence to go beyond a textbook, have you got any advice as to how to set up that environment in the home, resources, books, activities?
Absolutely. There's something that just leaps to mind that we're very enthusiastic about. There's a biochemist in New Mexico named Rebecca Keller, who has produced a series of very innovative, short science textbooks for young children. We call it, is it primary school in New Zealand? Our first 6th grades here we call primary school. So I speak English, but there's the Aussie, Kiwi, British, and North American.
Did you speak? Yeah, that's
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, typically, young children in school will only learn very descriptive science like astronomy or maybe a little geology. But Dr. Keller, Rebecca Keller, has created a series called Real Science for Kids. And she teaches the core scientific subjects of physics, chemistry, biology, as well as the more descriptive sciences at an early age and in a very innovative way. It happens that my sister-in-law has done she's a cartoonist and has done a lot of the drawings and the illustrations for the books. And so we're just very keen on them. We think they're excellent, an excellent resource. And it does, I think they're really tailored nicely to homeschooling parents who may feel a little intimidated by the thought of having to teach their kids science. So that's a resource. We also have a lot of videos that we have a cartoon book that we've done on the whole issue about Darwinian evolution called What's Darwin Got to Do with It? That we've got curriculum for the high school level, teenage kids as well, and that's supplementary to standard biology textbooks. So we have a book called Explore Evolution, teaching the arguments for and against Darwinian evolution. We teach the basic theory as students need to learn it, and then we teach the arguments on both sides. So we're very keen on what's called an inquiry-based approach to science education, where rather than just telling the kids the answer, we tell them the question and let them weigh the competing arguments. There's a short chemistry book that tells the history of one of our research fellows has written. It's a kind of almost a cartoon format. It's very accessible, and it basically gives the history of the discoveries that have been made in chemistry in order, and in the process you learn the concepts of chemistry by going through the historical development of the field in a way that suddenly it allows it to all make sense rather than just have the answer dropped on you. You're presented with the questions that people were confronted with when they were not even aware that there was something called oxygen. They used to call it dephlogisticated air. And then a French guy named Lavoisier came along and said, no, that's the wrong way to think of it. And so out of that came the concept of oxygen and the periodic table. And so it's a neat way to learn the science, to learn it historically. So I guess general recommendations, there are textbooks available that teach core scientific subjects at a much younger age. And we recommend availing that homeschool parents avail themselves of those. When you get to the older grades, if you use a classical model with the idea of you've got the grammar stage where you're learning the facts, and then you have the logical stage, and then the rhetorical stage. When you get to those more advanced stages, we think it's really great to present competing scientific interpretations of key subjects, and then teaching the students the competing arguments and letting them weigh them for themselves and wrestle with that. And we do that around the evolution question. So what was the other thing? Anyway, real science for kids and teaching science dialectically, so that it's not a dry subject where we're just dropping the answer. Teaching it historically and dialectically are things we would recommend. And we have a lot of resources of short videos. A series that anyone can find online very easily called a science uprising. It's definitely targeted towards a younger audience. It's got some, fast-paced visual effects and punchy style to it, but it looks at a lot of the big questions: the origin of the universe, the fossil record, things like that. So yeah, we'd be happy to share links to all that stuff and just give you a kind of trove of material that people can look through.
Yes, I will get links off you and make sure they're in the description area once this video goes up. That's fantastic. One of the things I regularly refer to in the podcasting is the importance of teaching your children how to think and not what to think. So that just shimmied on and just beautifully.
Absolutely. And I've been both a scientist and a philosopher. And when I was teaching philosophy, there was always a great emphasis on critical thinking. And I think that's important in learning, for example, the informal logical fallacies and some basic logic. And there are some tools that can be learned for evaluating arguments and having an appropriate critical mindset as you're evaluating those arguments. But I'm also a big fan of constructive thinking. And I think one of the things it's been a fad in education to emphasize critical thinking. Is a good fad because we need to be able to think critically and evaluate arguments carefully and sift fact from fiction and fallacy from validity and so forth. But I think if we only teach critical thinking, it does tend to it tends to allow us to develop a lot of cynicism, and we can be only critical and always sitting back and evaluating and never coming to a position ourselves. And I think that does trend towards a kind of cynicism. And there's a great quote from Francis Bacon. He said, "There be those discoursing wits who counted a bondage to fix a belief." And the idea that we should always be agnostic, never settle on a position, I think that's very anti-intellectual. That the great intellectual developments in Western culture have been made by people who formulated theories and synthesized information and gave us and recognized patterns and realized that there were truths as well as falsehoods that needed to be recognized and affirmed. And so the great glory, I think, of science is that it gives us theories that give us insight into how the world works and for which we often have reasons to believe they may be true. So we want to reject falsehood, but also affirm truth. And I think that that's a good part of that's a balance that is important to strike in homeschooling or any other kind of education. Mm. I think in the West we're in a secular age that's lost confidence in a source of truth. And so we've tended towards skepticism and cynicism. And I think that's unfortunate, because the glory of Western culture was its rootedness in the uni veritas, the one truth that flows from the Creator and informs our understanding of all subjects. And so we ought to be interested in affirming truth as well as rejecting falsehood.
You referred to intelligent design a few minutes ago. Could you please give an introduction, if you like, a 101, and define
Sure.
what that is, please?
Sure.
Thanks.
Right. Well, this is one of the things I work on personally. I've been involved in developing the contemporary theory of intelligent design. And the theory of intelligent design simply affirms that there are certain features of the natural world, of life and the universe, that are best explained by a designing intelligence rather than an undirected natural process, such as in the area of biology, natural selection acting on random mutations. If you think of the Darwinian view that things have arisen by purely undirected, unguided mutation and selection, natural selection. There are lots of different kinds of evidences of intelligent design, we think, and therefore we've had many research projects from scientists working in different fields. I've focused a lot of my scholarly endeavors on the question of the origin of the first life, which is closely related to the question of the origin of the information in DNA or RNA, these large information-bearing molecules that are necessary to build life. So one of the evidences of intelligent design that I tout in my books is the information-bearing properties of those large molecules that are necessary for building life. Another scientist in our network, Michael Behe, has written about the miniature machines that we're finding in cells, little tiny nano machines, rotary engines and sliding clamps and turbines and circuitry that has a property he calls irreducibly complex or irreducible complexity. It's a kind of integrated complexity that we recognize from our engineering world. And he thinks that's a feature that is best explained by the action of a designing intelligence rather than an unguided natural process. There are physicists talking about intelligent design, including a great Aussie, Luke Barnes, who's written a book called The Fortunate Universe. He did his PhD in Cambridge in physics, and he's been focusing on what's called the fine-tuning of the basic laws and properties of physics. The basic properties of physics fall within very narrow ranges or tolerances, such as if they were a little different one way or another, a little stronger, a little weaker, a little heavier, a little lighter, life would be impossible in the universe. And this has led many physicists to conclude that the universe is looks like it's a kind of setup job, that there was a fine tuner behind these finely tuned parameters. And so that's another evidence, we think, of a designing intelligence. And of course, there's a debate about all these things. If you're supportive of the fine-tuning design argument, there are people who argue, well, maybe there was an infinity of other universes that explains those improbable coincidences. And so there's an argument about whether fine-tuning is best explained by intelligent design or something called the multiverse. In my area, there are evolutionary theories that are that challenge intelligent design, and intelligent design is challenging those evolutionary theories. There's a theoretical competition between those perspectives. But basically, the idea is that there's evidence in the natural world of the activity of a designing mind, and that we can tell by looking at that evidence. In the United States, we have a famous landmark called Mount Rushmore, and it has it's a sculpted faces of some of our most famous presidents. And when you visit South Dakota in the middle of the country and you come to the National Monument and you see those faces, you immediately make what we call a design inference, because you recognize in the structure of those rock faces something that is not produced naturally, but would require intelligence to produce. And we have a theory about what allows us to detect intelligence. And the criteria that allow that detection are present in the faces on Mount Rushmore. And so there was a lot more to say about that, but it illustrates the idea that there are lots of things in our experience that make us aware that an intelligent agent was at work. Another good example would be going into the British Museum and seeing the Rosetta Stone. And when the archaeologists realized that those scratches on the rock were actually symbolic, that they were hieroglyphic inscriptions or letters in a language, then they realized, oh, we're dealing with an informational sequence here, a message. There must have been a scribe. There must have been an intelligence. These are the consequence of intelligent agency. So we're using that kind of reasoning to show that there is intelligence behind natural phenomena like the inner workings of the cell or those finely tuned physical parameters I was talking about, that were not the product of human intelligence, but of some pre-existing designing intelligence that's not human. I personally think it's the Lord God Almighty, but that's another debate.
So thinking about the mum putting together a curriculum for children, you've got two. You've got one who just needs to know about enough science to help them because they're just not going to go that way. It's just not their thing.
Right.
And then you've got other students that are just passionately interested and they want a career in science and anything. So you've got two needs. So let's concentrate on the first student first, who just needs to be taught what they need to know about science that is going to equip them in life for the rest of it. And as an example, I'm thinking of that over the last couple of years, we have been told from officialdom, trust the science or follow the science. So how does somebody who hasn't been trained in the sciences, that just had like a basic scientific education, manage that kind of statement and instruction? How do you test these things?
Yeah, that's a very interesting and topical question. I just very practically, I think, for example, that series that I mentioned, Real Science for Kids, is something that would be very useful in those early primary grades in establishing a foundation, and at a time when it may not be clear whether a student's inclinations are towards science or the humanities or music or something else. And so it makes it possible for young children to learn basic scientific concepts in a way that might actually inspire a lot of scientific interest, but would provide a foundation for all students, whether they're going to specialize in science later or not. I think the other question you ask is, and then when you get beyond those grades, I think there are a lot of standard science textbooks that are very good on teaching biology, chemistry, physics, but typically what's missing is conceptual education at a younger age so that students can make full use of those textbooks. I think the other question you're asking about what do we do about claims about consensus science, especially around ideologically charged issues, because I think that's where there are metaphysically or there are worldview neutral questions in science. What is the formula for salt? Well, it's NaCl, whether you're a pantheist, a theist, an atheist, or something else. But our view of the origin of the universe, our origin of life, may be very much influenced by our worldview, or our view of the origin of life may have implications for worldview. So there are topics that have an ideological dimension, and we've encountered this also with other topics in science that may have a political dimension. It may be a philosophical dimension, and for that reason they may be ideological, maybe a religious dimension, but it may be political as well. So the debate about climate change is a debate about what the mean global temperature is doing, and various factors that influence climate and so forth. But it's also a policy debate about what are we going to do if we think there is or is not significant human-caused global warming, and so topics like that very quickly will involve two elements. They'll involve a strictly empirical, analytical, scientific element, but then there's a so what? There's an implication for religion or philosophy or politics or public health, which is really essentially a policy matter, and that's where it's I think very important not to allow an ideological view or a particular view which may be favored for ideological reasons to represent the whole of scientific opinion. It's very important to have an open approach to science. There's a wonderful Italian philosopher of science named Marcello Opera, who says that science advances as scientists argue about how to interpret the evidence. And therefore, he says there's a rhetorical dimension of science. There's argumentation and the freedom to express competing views and competing arguments is fundamental to the progress of science, and fundamental to evaluating scientific claims that are made in the name of the science. I tend to be very suspicious when people talk about the science, because when there really is a scientific consensus, scientists don't usually need to refer to it to settle the argument. There is a consensus that the formula for water is H2O and the formula for salt is NaCl. So nobody says, well, according to consensus science, the formula for the water is H2O. Because there is a consensus, no one refers to the consensus. People typically refer to consensus science or settled science when the questions aren't settled, and when there isn't a consensus, you refer to consensus when there's a dissenting group of scientists that you want to silence, either because you find their opinion challenging or threatening, or You may be in competition for research dollars. So I think we need to protect ourselves against an authoritarian view of science. We need to be aware of these sociological dynamics, that science doesn't say anything, scientists say things. And as one of my Cambridge supervisors used to say, whenever there's beware the sound of one hand clapping, he would say. If there's an argument on one side of the issue, there's bound to be an argument on the other. So it's very important, I think, to teach our students to be sensitive to that kind of dynamic and to learn to weigh competing arguments as they're learning about scientific topics. And that can be done, again, by focusing on the history of science and on contemporary scientific issues where there's debate as well.
Thank you. I get the feeling that could be a complete podcast by itself. All right, let's go to the other student now who has plans because they want to be a scientist in the broad sense of it. What is imperative for the parents putting together what they need? What do they need to know before they get into the universities? And what kind of goes with that is that for people of faith, there's a very high attrition rate once students get into university. How can a parent and a high school student at home prepare for that possibility? So what you've got important subjects.
Really important, but different questions. Maybe I take let's do the first one first.
Thank you.
I think it's very important to let students who have passionate interest in a single subject run with it. We've tended to think that the best way to educate students is to make sure that they know a little bit about a lot of things. But there are things that happen when someone has a passion for something and is allowed to burrow and go deep. There's a cognitive development that takes place in that. If you learn a little bit about a lot of things, you only tax your mind to a certain degree. If you're allowed to really learn a lot about something and maybe to write an extended paper on it or do research, and if you learn a little bit about a lot of things, you don't end up doing a serious research project. You don't write a long paper. You don't write a long essay. You don't dig and make any new discoveries. You just skim the surface. So it is good to have a broad general education, but it's also really good for students, especially bright or talented students who are showing aptitude in a particular area, to be allowed to develop that in some depth. And so if you've got somebody we kind of all know that kind of kid who's got a new passionate interest every 2 months. I had a young man I tutored who was into the whole Linnaean classification system as a 7-year-old, and he wanted to classify he wanted to map the world, so he wanted to know what kind of thing everything was. Well, I had the occasion to tutor him because it was a family friend, and I thought it was wonderful. The parents just let him run with this, and indulge that interest until he moved on to a new one, So you have the freedom to do that with homeschooling a bit more. And so getting that balance right between allowing a student to burrow and still having a broad general education is a challenge, but I think there should be elements of both in a good homeschooling curriculum. Now, as to the other question, I had an article in the American magazine, Now Online, Newsweek, earlier in the summer about this very question of students in particular losing their faith when they go to university. The Gallup polling in the United States shows that belief in God has dipped to an all-time low. It's still fairly high at 80%, but it's dropped 10% in just a decade. So we've had a big shift. And the pollsters are finding that this is largely driven by young people in the 18 to 30 year age range. And it typically is the result of what happens to them when they go to university. We've actually done some public opinion polling at Discovery, some surveys ourselves, trying to probe, well, what's behind that loss of belief in young people? Our pollsters here in America call it the rise of the nuns, where the nuns aren't ladies in habits, but they're that's their term for the religiously unaffiliated. The religiously unaffiliated agnostics and atheists, often in that younger age group. And we found that that interestingly, science is cited as one of the most common factors for among people who have lost belief in God or who will refuse to consider it. 65% of young atheists and 43% of young agnostics say that science makes belief in God less probable, less likely. It's almost a perfect echo of an argument you hear from Richard Dawkins and his book, The God Delusion. So the arguments of these so-called new atheist authors from, those books started coming out around 2007, but they've been publishing them continuously since, arguing that science properly understood undermines belief in God, are percolating into the wider culture. Kids pick this up on social media, they get it from teachers, and there's been a kind of a default secularism in our mainstream Western universities for quite some time now. It predates the new atheists. Their atheism isn't new at all. So that's a challenge for parents of faith who want to inculcate faith in their kids. And it's a challenge for students who have faith when they go off to university, because they often find they'll find two different kinds of professors, two different kinds of secular professors. One type will simply assume that all reasonable people agree and won't ever make any explicit arguments for a secular or naturalistic or atheistic worldview, but will, in every way they present the specifics of a subject, present it as if everyone knew it was true that theism is an untenable worldview, that belief in God is disreputable, that religion has nothing to do with anything practical in life. So there'll be kind of a pervasive set of assumptions that are conveyed to students one way or another. And over time, young people listening to this and listening to the conversation of their peers will just start to feel like they're the odd man or odd young woman out, that everybody else got the memo and they didn't. They still believe in God. They go home, their parents believe in God. They may go to church at holiday time, but they know that for some reason, they're not thinking, the way their parents thought is not the way all these sophisticated people at university thought. Now, they may not have ever gotten an argument for rejecting Christianity or rejecting theism, or if they're Jewish, Judaism, or they may never have gotten an argument. It's just in the water. It's the pervasive way that people talk reveals a completely different worldview. The other type of secular professor is the aggressive proselytizing atheist, and who will ridicule Christian beliefs in particular, or theistic beliefs, belief in God. And we've had many conversations with students who have encountered those types of professors as well. Of the two, I think the professors who simply assume a secular worldview and never defend it are possibly more dangerous to the faith of young people, because if an argument is never made, it is not vulnerable to being refuted. Whereas if a professor puts their cards on the table, it does allow the student to know in no uncertain terms where the professor is coming from. And that makes it a little easier sometimes for some, but other students are very adversely affected in their faith formation by professors who ridicule the faith and make arguments that they don't know how to respond to. And so that leads to, I think, what is important to do to prepare students for those university years. We should definitely not be sheltering students from the kind of arguments and perspectives they're going to encounter. That's why when we do our little, have it on the shelf here, but we have this textbook, Explore Evolution. And we teach the Darwinian argument in its full glory as they will encounter it, and in fact, in more detail than they'll typically encounter it in university. But we also teach the counter arguments to that as the students, as you find them if you look at peer-reviewed literature in the sciences. So we give them try to give them an iron sharpening iron experience where they can weigh arguments on both sides. And so they're also made aware of why secular people have the particular positions they do on a given subject. So that kind of preparation, I think, is important to especially in the late high school years before going off to university. Allow students to encounter the arguments for a competing worldview in their full force, but then also help them process them and think about the counter arguments. And in other words, it comes back to Andrew's concept that students need reasons for faith, and we need to provide those and expose them. There's there's wonderful evidences for the reality of God. There's philosophical arguments for theism as the best explanatory worldview. There's evidence for the archaeological evidence for the reliability of the Bible. This type of apologetic needs to be part of a good Christian or theistic homeschooling education, because we have a colleague in Oxford, John Lennox, the math professor there, and he says we're losing our students because we're not answering their questions. And an American apologist named Frank Turek says students are getting talked out of faith because they've never been talked into it, he says. They've never been given an argument. So there again, I think argumentation is very important. It's part of the way we come to learn the truth, as we weigh competing arguments. So we need to teach our students to weigh competing arguments, and we need to give them arguments for the faith if we're going to expect them to survive the challenge that they'll get from people making counter arguments when they get to university.
Oh, thank you.
That was a long answer. I'm really sorry. Yeah.
But it's such an important answer, because when you've decided to not delegate the education of your children, you're clearly thinking about what you want to do. And when you feel like you're doing everything that you can, it can come as a bit of a rude shock at the possibility you might lose some of your children to their faith. And sometimes I think there's a denial amongst parents of faith that this could possibly happen to their child. So I think by implication, I'm hearing you say, Steve, that there's no need to fear this. What you need to do is to equip them.
No. Yes, exactly. I mean, I may be unusual in this, but I think Christian theism is, as C.S. Lewis thought. He said, I believe I believe Christianity, like I believe in the sun, and by it I see all other things. It has this unique explanatory power. It makes sense of the world. It makes sense of, the biblical view is, I think, the most consonant with our observations of human nature. I think the biblical view gives an account of what we mean by morality that is coherent, whereas secular views of morality either trend towards a relativism that we can't live with, or affirming a moral objectivism that can't be justified. I mean, I could go litany, and then there's all the evidence that we have for intelligent design and for God as the designer. My new book is talking about the 3 big discoveries that point to God. The universe had a beginning. It's been finely tuned against all odds from the beginning. We have these big infusions of information into our biosphere, where information we experience is a product of mind. We've got amazing evidence for the reality of God, for the reliability of the Bible, for the coherency of the Christian worldview. We, of all people, should not be insecure about engaging the intellectual, the thought world, the intellectual world, the world of the university. In fact, the university is a Christian invention. It literally meant uni veritas, one truth. And it's a medieval Christian invention. So we need to regain our swagger and go back into the intellectual realms and say, you know, we have something to offer here, folks. Christianity gave rise to modern science. It was critical to the formation of the hospital movement. It was critical to medicine and representative democracy and the concept of human rights. Christianity has been the framework that shaped the West. And so we shouldn't be insecure about our viewpoint or our worldview. And we need to convey that to our young people. It's hard right now because our universities are very secular, and there are ideological currents that are very opposed to Christianity. But we needn't be insecure. And I think that's something that can be inculcated in a homeschooling environment, maybe uniquely, because you have time to go deep with students.
I've got a couple of your books here, Steve. This one goes back a little ways, and then we've got this one. Oops, that one. What's the new book you're referring to?
Well, the new book is The Return of the God Hypothesis that you're holding.
Yeah.
The previous book, Darwin's Doubt, I have fond memories of New Zealand because of that, because I got to give a lecture at the University of Auckland on that, and it was a very spirited discussion. And I left all my Kiwi friends to field the aftermath of that, and then we flew out the next day. So I don't know how much trouble we caused, but it was a really great night. I mean, a lot of really good discussion. And that book also took this developed the rhetorical dimension to science, because I pointed out that there was this mystery that Darwin had been unable to solve in his time, which was his own awareness of the abrupt appearance of the major groups of animals in the fossil record, and how that didn't match his idea of a gradual branching tree. And so the book was about this doubt that Darwin had about the adequacy of his theory. He didn't doubt his theory itself, but he doubted that it could explain that and a few other pieces of evidence, and what became of that doubt, and then the arguments that scientists have had about the different perspectives about how to solve that problem of what I call the mystery of the missing fossils. So it was it was not a book, it's not a textbook, but I took the kind of approach in the book that we actually recommend for science education.
Excellent. I'll definitely put those links in too for listeners. Kind of getting to rounding things up here, I would like to ask you about the Discovery Institute, and you've referred to the summer program as well. If we've got students, homeschooling students, who are interested in approaching you at the Institute, what should they do if they want to work with you or study under you or something like that?
We have a program, a summer program that is designed for university students and postgraduates, master's or PhD students. We take students starting, our system has 4 years of undergraduate. Are you on the British system with 3, or how does it work in New Zealand? I can't remember.
Three.
Okay, so we would be happy to take a second or third year Kiwi science student in our summer program. Usually, it's because it's summer, it's usually nice to have maybe 2 years under your belt and then catch the student as they're rising third year. And so we're set up to do that. We have a 10-day intensive. We've done it typically in Seattle on the West Coast. We've also done it a little more inland in Denver because there's some very good facilities there. We've even done it online during the COVID. So, we're really thrilled with the results of that program. We have over 300 students that have been through it. It might be even 500, but we also have over 30 students who are now faculty members in their own right as at universities or in the U.S. and internationally. So we have some students who take who go through the intensive seminar and pursue careers in science. We have a lot of science researchers, people who are postdocs who aren't professors yet. So, but we have other people who go into various different fields. But what we do is we kind of do a full immersion. 8 hours a day and then discussion at night. I mean, it's really intense. And we bring in all our best people in all the key subject areas. So there's physics, there's chemistry, there's biology, there's biochemistry, there's molecular biology, there's astronomy, there's philosophy of science, there's science and religion discussions, and we just kind of go for it and let the students interact with top people who share our basic perspective. They would be mainly scientists who also are advocates of intelligent design. Many are theists and have a religious view. Some are skeptical of Darwinism but aren't religious. But it's been a really great time, and students have really connect with each other because they often get to university. If they are people of faith, they'll feel pretty isolated. They don't know if anyone else is thinking the way they are, and they get with other students who have a similar viewpoint, who are interested in the question of intelligent design, and they just ignite and get, so they make friends. We've had quite a few marriages result from kids that met at summer seminar, and actually a young couple that's working for us at Discovery who are just superstar young people. So that's another, it's just been a great thing socially for students who may feel isolated because they have a religious worldview that is contrary to the dominant way people are thinking at university. And then they meet other people who share their perspective and also share their deep interest in science. And that's made for some really great friendships. So that's something we can offer. Yeah.
My husband and I both met at Bible college.
That's fantastic.
So yeah, similar but different. So if somebody wants information about coming to the summer program, what should they do?
Go to discovery.org, look for the page for the Center for Science and Culture, and there's information there. Or they could email one of our key staff guys who works in organizing this every year. His name is Brian Miller. He's bmiller@discovery.org. And he's a PhD in physics from Duke. And he did complex systems physics, which put him into biology as well. So he's a polymath, and he's been very good at helping us evaluate applications. And he teaches in the summer seminar. So he's someone you can reach out to directly.
Oh, thank you. Last question, Steve. Is there anything we haven't touched on today that you would like to mention that would be particularly helpful for homeschool families?
Well, maybe just reprising a point I made early on in the interview about the value of teaching science historically, teaching the history of science. For one thing, it's a very faith-affirming exercise because so many of the early scientists were men, at that time almost all men, but men of great faith. I recently made the discovery that a scientist that I've long admired, John Ray, who wrote a book called The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation, was the tutor of a mathematician named Isaac Barrow, who was the tutor of Sir Isaac Newton. And so there's this whole tradition, they called the British natural theology, the tradition of British natural theology. All of these guys were hugely important scientists in forming the foundations of modern science. And they all made seminal contributions to their fields, biology, math, and physics sequentially, Ray, Barrow, Newton. And they were all men of deep faith. And they were all part of this natural theological tradition that thought that nature revealed the creator. So the cool discovery that I made is that actually my wife Elaine made this. She was ordering some rare science books of old for me, and we found some stuff about John Ray. Turned out he went to the same college I did. I was at St. Catherine's College in Cambridge, and so gave me an eerie feeling of coming full circle to this point of view that had gone into, it had waxed for a while or waned for a while, but it's coming back now. And I've been fortunate enough to be part of a network of scientists who are bringing it back, and it kind of made me happy to think that this founder of the natural theological tradition was all at the same college in Cambridge that I later, 400 years later, or 300 years later, attended. So
very, very cool.
Yeah.
Stephen, Dr. Meyer, thank you so much. I know that the listeners are going to deeply appreciate your wisdom, experience, and insight. Thank you.
Thank you for reconnecting and for having me on and allowing me to share some things that I care about.
Lovely.